The storm had been building for hours, a low, restless growl across the black steppe. Now it broke in full, hammering the Khan's encampment with sheets of rain that rattled the silk walls of his great tent like the skin of a war drum. Lightning flared and vanished, throwing shadows that seemed to twist and breathe on their own. Inside, the air was heavy thick with the perfume of incense, musk, and the faint metallic scent of old blood that no amount of fragrance could truly mask. Gerbal knelt in the adjoining chamber, still and silent as the other women fussed over her hair. Every strand was twisted into the elaborate knot the Khan preferred, a style so dense and intricate that no guard's hands would dare unravel it, concealed within the coils. A blade no longer than her palm pressed against her scalp, cool and certain. She felt its presence as keenly as she once felt her mother's hand on her shoulder, an anchor in the dark. It had taken her 3 years to reach this night. 3 years of silence, of swallowing rage until it tasted like air, of smiling just enough to avoid suspicion, but never enough to invite the wrong kind of favor. She had learned the rhythms of this empire not from the grand speeches of generals, but from the whispers in the women's quarters, which guards drank too heavily, which nights the Khan lingered in his tent, which ceremonies dulled his senses with fermented mare's milk. Outside, the guards hunched in their cloaks, attention broken by the storm. Inside, every detail of the great tent's interior, every silk partition, every lacquered chest, every shadow was burned into her mind. This was the same tent where emissaries from far kingdoms had bowed, where maps marked the conquest of cities she had once dreamed of visiting, where gold and blood mingled freely beneath the same roof. Tonight, it would become a tomb. She thought of her mother's scream as she leapt from the tower wall in Tangut, her brothers, their heads mounted on spears by the gate, the weeks of being prodded, scored, and measured like livestock until she was declared nearly perfect and marked for the Khan himself. And she thought, most of all, of the millions before her women whose names the world would never know, whose bodies had been added to his empire like conquered provinces. The flap of the inner curtain stirred, and the Khan's voice came thick with drink, but still bearing the command of a man who had never been denied. Come. She rose. Every step toward him was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Her bare feet sank into the layered carpets, each one looted from a different defeated kingdom. The storm masked the sound of her breathing, in her mind. She counted the beats of his life 3 steps from the threshold to the couch. 1 motion to loosen the knot, 1 draw to free the blade, 1 thrust to find the place beneath his ribs, or perhaps better lower, where his empire's true weapon lay. When she lowered herself beside him, she caught the faint, sour scent of old wounds under the perfume. His eyes half closed, satisfied already with the thought of what would follow. He had no idea. Not yet. Gerbal's hand drifted to her hair, fingers finding the familiar pressure of the concealed steel. The storm swelled outside, rain drumming harder, wind tearing at the tent ropes like impatient hands. She could almost hear the voices of the dead in its howl, her family's, her people's, the thousands claimed before her. For them, for Tangut, for the girls still waiting in the selection lines in cities yet to fall, she would not tremble, not now. The blade came free with a whisper, and the storm roared in answer. Long before the night of the storm, before the Khan's name became a curse whispered in markets from China to Persia, there was only Temujin, a young man with no empire, no legend, and no reason to believe the world would remember him. In the winter of 1184, he was simply a tribal leader trying to hold together a fragile alliance in the harsh, endless steppe. His greatest asset then was not an army, but a promise his new wife, Borte. They had married as teenagers, a union forged less from romance than from necessity. Her family's connections offered him stability, and his ambition offered her a future at least in theory, in the brittle cold of the Mongolian plateau. Alliances were as valuable as horses, and far more fragile. But in those first months, there was a sense of possibility. Bort's presence at his side lent him legitimacy among the clans. Her dark hair and calm bearing stood out in the chaos of camp life, a silent signal to friend and rival alike that Temujin was no longer just a boy chasing power. He was a man building it. But the steppe never forgets a blood debt, the Merkits. An older, more powerful tribe still remembered a theft committed decades earlier, when Temujin's father had stolen a woman from among them. The debt had been festering for years, and in the gray light before dawn, they came to collect. The first sound was the pounding of hooves, 30 riders moving as one, their silhouettes swallowing the horizon. They swept through the camp with the efficiency of men who had rehearsed revenge. Temujin, startled from sleep, had only moments to act, and in that moment, he chose the horse over the sword. He fled into the open plain, vanishing into the white breath of his mount while the shouts behind him twisted into something darker. Bordy's tent was torn open. Rough hands dragged her into the snow, her bare feet kicking against the frost, her voice drowned by the chaos. The Merkits took her north, away from everything she had known, into a world where she would become the possession of Chilgur, a warrior who claimed her as spoils of war. 8 months. That was the length of her captivity, measured not in days but in a slow erosion of self. The chronicles are clean, almost polite. In their descriptions, they speak of detainment, hospitality, and marriage, careful words to smooth over the jagged reality. But every Mongol understood what those months meant. A woman taken by enemies was marked forever, her body transformed into a ledger of humiliation no man could erase. When Temujin finally returned for her, he did not come alone. He had the help of his blood brother Jamuka, and together they struck into Merkit territory, killing without pause until they found her. She was heavily pregnant. The boy she carried would be named Jochi Guest, a name that carried with it the unspoken question of his blood, a question Temujin never answered aloud, but never stopped asking in his own mind. He claimed the child publicly, but in private. Doubt coiled tight in his chest, in every line of Yochi's face. He searched for traces of the man who had taken Borte. But it wasn't only the child that haunted him. It was the soundless gap in his memory, the nights when he imagined her in another man's tent. The glances from his own warriors, who wondered if their leader's honor had been compromised. In the rigid code of the steppe, this was not simply a personal wound, it was a political one, a visible scar across his authority. Temujin had rescued Borte's body, but in the eyes of his people, he had not rescued her honor, and that. He could not forgive not the Merkits, not himself. That morning, when he had fled, leaving her to be taken, became the moment his life split in two. The man who rode away was gone forever. In his place stood someone colder, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. The rescue of Borde did not bring Temujin peace, if anything. It sharpened something inside him, a jagged edge that cut deeper the longer it remained. Each time he looked at her, he saw not only the woman he had married, but the 8 months he had failed her. In the flicker of firelight across her face, he imagined the shadows of other hands, other voices, in the Mongol mind. A woman taken by enemies carried shame forever. But Temujin carried something else alongside it, an open wound that could not heal unless it was cauterized with blood. The Merkits had made him a victim. That status could not stand. On the steppe, a man's power was measured not only by the land he held, but by his ability to avenge every insult tenfold. And so, the vengeance began. The campaign against the Merkits was not a battle. It was an extermination. Temujin did not simply target the men who had raided his camp. He ordered the destruction of the entire tribe warriors, elders, women, children. It was as if he had taken the humiliation done to Borte and projected it outward, making every Merkit carry it in their final moments. Villages burned until the night sky itself glowed. Survivors were rare, and those taken captive were not spared. Their fate was a mirror of Borde's own captivity, replayed on a scale the Merkits had never imagined. But something in this vengeance was new, and it was not just rage. Temujin began to see a use for the weapon that had been turned against him. Sexual violence, in his hands, became more than an act of personal revenge. It became a tool, a strategy, a way to crush an enemy's future by breaking their bloodline, to destroy not only the bodies of his foes, but the thread of their people's existence. His men understood quickly. Captured women were no longer simply spoils, they were instruments of policy. Their possession humiliated surviving warriors and erased the possibility of their children inheriting the tribe's legacy. A merchant girl carrying the child of a Mongol would raise that child as Mongol, and in a generation, her people's name would be little more than a fading echo. Temujin had taken the most intimate violation he knew and re-engineered it into a weapon of conquest. Each village destroyed, each woman taken, became another stitch in a grim tapestry. The merchants were the first to be undone this way, but they would not be the last. His warriors saw the results: fewer rebellions, swifter surrenders. The shame inflicted on the merchants had been so complete that it echoed through their survivors like a curse. And as the steppe carried word of what Temujin had done, other tribes began to fear not just defeat, but erasure. From that point forward, this was the pattern fight: break, humiliate, and absorb. The methods that had once been used to punish one tribe became the standard operating procedure for an empire still unborn. Temujin could not undo the moment he fled from the merchants' raid, but he could ensure no enemy ever inflicted that humiliation on him again, because now he would inflict it first. And the merchants, who had once stolen a woman from his father and then from him, ceased to exist as a people. Their name was swallowed by history, remembered only as the spark that lit a fire no one could put out. What began as a personal vendetta hardened into something colder, an official mechanism of conquest: Temujin, now well on the path to becoming Genghis Khan, understood that battles won on the field could be lost in the generations that followed. A tribe could rebuild its herds, train new warriors, and reclaim lost territory. But if you dismantled its bloodline, if you seeded its future with your own blood, then you owned more than their land. You owned their lineage. This was no longer revenge. It was governance by violation. Sexual domination became a kind of spiritual victory in his eyes, a way to claim an enemy's legacy as Mongol property, in Mongol thinking. Children were not just descendants, they were living continuations of the clan. If those children now carried Mongol blood, spoke Mongol words, and revered Mongol ancestors, then the enemy was erased from the inside out. The Khan began to refine this into a repeatable process. In each conquest, women of the defeated were gathered and distributed according to strict hierarchies. His closest generals received the most valuable captives, those of noble birth, great beauty, or political significance. Lower ranks received women deemed less strategic, but still worthy of reward, and those with the lowest ranking, whether due to age, perceived beauty, or resistance, were sent to serve in the mobile brothels that followed the Mongol armies. It was methodical, it was consistent, and it was terrifying in its efficiency. The Khan's orders were not chaotic bursts of brutality. They were codified into military routine. Officers were appointed to oversee the selection, record the origins of each woman, and ensure she was delivered to her assigned place. In this system, a woman could be treated like a warhorse, evaluated for usefulness, reassigned as needed, replaced when she could no longer serve. Genghis Khan's genius as a military organizer now extended to this dark policy. The same skills that built the postal relay system and coordinated cavalry across continents were applied to the control of women's bodies, in his mind. There was no difference between conquering a fortress and conquering a bloodline. Both were trophies. Both proved the absolute dominance of the Mongol name. Modern psychologists would call it the transformation of trauma into power, a way of rewriting his own humiliation through the humiliation of others. But in the 13th century, there was no such vocabulary. There was only the visible proof that it worked: fewer uprisings, faster surrenders, and a growing Mongol population seeded into every conquered people. It was here, in this cold conversion of personal rage into imperial strategy, that the future horrors of the empire were born. From the smoky tents of the steppes to the marble palaces of Persia, the Khan's policy would reach, leaving scars deeper than any sword. And at its center was one man who could not protect one woman, so he took thousands. By the time Genghis Khan's empire began to stretch across continents, his personal household had grown into something that defied comprehension. Not even his generals knew the exact number until the imperial scribes recorded it: 7,000 women. This was not a boast whispered in campfire bravado. It was an official figure, written in ledgers, counted and confirmed like a tribute of gold or a tally of horses. 7,000 women meant an entire city's worth of lives, each one uprooted, evaluated, and assigned to a place in a system as rigid as any military division. Managing them required its own bureaucracy. Administrators tracked origins, scores, assignments, and movements with the same precision they used to follow troop deployments. The process began after each conquest. Captured women were gathered in central courtyards or open fields and stripped not just of clothing, but of any illusion that they were seen as human beings. Officials moved among them with tablets and styluses, marking scores based on age, beauty, noble birth, and most prized of all, virginity. Each factor carried mathematical weight. A young princess from a noble house might score in the high 90s. A merchant's widow could expect the 60s. Anything lower than that placed a woman in the most dangerous category of all. Those with scores above 90 were sent directly to the Khan's personal collection. The 80s went to generals who had distinguished themselves in battle, the 70s to trusted officers, the 60s to ordinary soldiers, below 60. The fate was brutal assignment to the mobile brothels that followed the Mongol armies across their campaigns. These brothels were not chaotic dens of disorder. They were organized with chilling discipline. Women were numbered instead of named, their usage recorded in ledgers as though they were part of a supply chain. Special officers monitored their health, not from compassion, but to maintain inventory quality for as long as possible. When illness or injury rendered them unfit for service, they were discarded without ceremony, replaced by the next wave of captives. Even for those in the Khan's own harem, life was no gentler. His women were organized by ethnicity: Chinese in one section, Persian in another, Russian nobles in a third, turning the great encampment into a living map of conquest. The divisions were not merely aesthetic, they were trophies. Every glance across his tent compound reminded visitors of the breadth of his power, each row of women a monument to a fallen people. To keep order, the Khan's administrators devised rotating schedules so that no woman saw him too often. Maintaining both novelty and control, women past childbearing age were reassigned as attendants or servants to the younger captives. Those who bore him sons gained status, their children marked for military or political roles in the empire. It was a perverse incentive system, one that encouraged cooperation under the shadow of constant threat. Financially, the scale was staggering. Feeding, clothing, and transporting thousands of women across the empire consumed resources on par with maintaining entire cavalry divisions. Estimates suggest as much as 15% of imperial revenues went into sustaining this machinery of sexual exploitation. This was not a side effect of conquest, it was conquest, carried out in human form, a system as structured, as intentional, and as relentless as the Mongol war machine itself. Within the Khan's vast system of sexual subjugation, even the arrangement of women was a statement of power. His personal harem was more than a private indulgence, it was a catalog of the known world. Chinese beauties dressed in silks embroidered with phoenixes, Persian princesses adorned in gold-threaded veils, Russian noblewomen pale as winter snow. Each group was kept in its own quarter, marked by the customs of their homeland, as if the Khan's tent complex were a living museum of conquered civilizations. For the Khan, this was deliberate. Any visiting envoy or ally walking through his gur would see not just wealth, but evidence of how far his reach extended. These women were human trophies, proof that his empire spanned climates, languages, and bloodlines. But maintaining such a system required innovations beyond the battlefield. Rotations were carefully planned, so that women were moved between locations or roles before they could form alliances strong enough to plot escape. The Khan's administrators kept meticulous records not just of their scores and origins, but of their reproductive histories. Pregnant women were logged, monitored, and reassigned to ensure healthy births. A son could secure a mother's survival. A daughter might grant her a few more years before reassignment. Those who aged beyond the prime years for childbearing were not discarded outright. Instead, they became attendants for younger captives, tasked with ensuring compliance, teaching court customs, and maintaining the illusion of order. These older women, often once high-ranking in their own societies, were now reduced to enforcing the very system that had broken them. Beyond the Khan's personal harem, the same principles applied to the mobile brothels that traveled with the Mongol armies. These were not crude tents thrown together in haste. They were organized facilities that followed the rhythm of campaign seasons. Each was staffed by guards distinct from the regular military, chosen for their loyalty and skill in preventing escape. Food, clothing, and even basic medical care were supplied along the same supply chains that fed the cavalry. The aim was never compassion, it was efficiency. A sick or injured woman was a diminished resource, and resources had to be preserved until they were no longer useful. Ethnic separation was practiced here as well. Mongol commanders believed that different origins provided different experiences, and so the brothels became segmented spaces, Russians in one, Persians in another, Tangut women elsewhere. To the Mongols, these distinctions were a form of luxury, as if sexual violence could be curated like fine wine. For the women trapped within this machinery, the differences in treatment were minimal. Those considered more valuable endured the isolation of belonging to a single owner, cut off from all others. Those deemed lesser faced the relentless demands of the collective, their bodies treated as communal property. In either case, the result was the same erasure of identity, subjugation of will, and the conversion of life into service. By now, the Khan system had evolved into a structure so vast and organized that it could not be dismantled easily. It was an institution rooted not in the chaos of war, but in the cold logic of empire building, and as with all Mongol systems, it was built to expand. The year was 1202, and the Khan had just crushed the Tatar Confederation, a rival power that had poisoned his father decades earlier. Victory on the battlefield was not enough. The memory of his father's death, the humiliation of the Merkits, and his growing belief in conquest by bloodline all came together in what would become a grim blueprint for future campaigns. The order was explicit and methodical. Every Tatar male taller than the height of a wagon axle, roughly 3 feet, was to be executed. Boys young enough to forget their heritage were spared, destined to be raised as Mongols. But the women faced a different fate. They were to be distributed among Mongol warriors like battlefield spoils, with the same calculated precision used to divide captured horses or plundered gold. Younger women were assigned to the elite, older women to common soldiers. But the division was not random. It was part of a larger vision. The Khan understood that by ensuring Tatar women bore Mongol children, he could erase Tatar bloodlines within a generation. The children would be Mongol in name, in culture, in loyalty. The Tatars would disappear, not through slaughter alone, but through absorption. Survivors' accounts describe scenes of cold efficiency, husbands executed in front of their wives, daughters pried from their mother's arms, families shattered and scattered among different units to ensure no surviving bonds. Guards watched through the nights, binding women's hands to prevent suicide, posting sentries to stop escapes, even death. To the Tatars, became a privilege denied. Pregnancy was not an accident, it was the policy. Pregnant women were monitored, and any signs of resistance met with public punishment so brutal it silenced entire camps. The Mongols had devised what modern law would call a systematic campaign of forced pregnancy, a form of genocide carried out not with swords alone, but with wombs turned into weapons. And yet, not all Tatars submitted quietly. Some flung themselves into rivers or from cliffs rather than live in captivity. Others took their own lives in secret, finding ways to end pregnancies before they could produce another generation for their conquerors. The Mongols responded with greater control, turning survival itself into a prison from which there was no escape. Within a generation, the Tatar identity began to dissolve. Genetic evidence centuries later would confirm what witnesses already knew in regions once held by Tatars. Mongol Y chromosomes replaced local male lineages almost entirely. The Khan had not only destroyed their armies, he had stolen their future, replacing it with his own. What happened to the Tatars became a template. The policies perfected in this campaign, mass executions of men, systematic sexual enslavement of women, forced pregnancies, and the deliberate erasure of a people's name would be repeated again and again as the Mongol Empire spread. For the Khan, it was no longer vengeance, it was strategy. When a city fell to the Mongols, the killing did not end with the clash of steel. The battlefield quiet was only the prelude to another, more methodical violence, the selection. Survivors called it the sorting. But to the Mongols, it was simply another step in conquest, as routine as collecting tribute or dividing livestock. Women and girls were gathered in central squares or open courtyards, surrounded by armed guards. The air was heavy with smoke from still smoldering ruins. Soldiers barked orders, stripping the captives of their clothes, their jewelry, their last fragments of dignity. Officially, the removal of garments was to ensure no weapons were concealed. In truth, it was to lay bare every inch of flesh for evaluation. Mongol officials moved along the lines with styluses and wooden tablets, their faces expressionless as they recorded scores. Age came first too young, and a girl was considered useless for immediate purposes. Too old, and she was expendable unless she had a valuable skill like medicine or fine weaving. The preferred range was chillingly specific, 8 to 35, with variations based on the rank of the men who would receive them. Physical beauty mattered, but the Mongols also valued political leverage. A nobleman's daughter, even if plain, could be a valuable gift to secure an alliance or reward a loyal commander. Virgins were prized above all, their status confirmed by invasive examinations carried out in full public view. The selection itself became a weapon of humiliation, with mothers and daughters made to stand side by side. Knowing that youth and beauty would determine survival, the criteria were never explained to the captives, and that was intentional. The arbitrariness bred fear women could not predict their fate, and so hope and terror coiled tightly together in their minds. The highest scorers would be taken into private ownership, sometimes to the Khan himself, while those deemed less valuable were sent to military brothels. Those rejected entirely were often killed on the spot, their deaths serving as a warning to others. Survivors tell of the jeering from Mongol soldiers during these rituals, of crude jokes in foreign tongues, of hands that inspected them like market goods. At Samarkand, a Persian chronicler recorded that 40,000 women were processed over 3 days. Those not chosen were herded beyond the city walls, and the screams that followed told the rest of the story. The process was not just about acquiring women, it was about breaking the conquered. Selection destroyed dignity before any physical violence began, by making women parade before their captors, stripped and scored. The Mongols asserted control over their bodies and their identities. It told the survivors that resistance was pointless, that every aspect of their lives, even their worth, was now in the hands of the empire. For the Mongols, this was efficiency. For the women, it was the moment they ceased to be members of their own people and became property of the Khan's machine. And for one young Tangut princess who would one day hold a hidden blade, it was the day her life's purpose began to take shape. In the chaos of the selection lines, where fear thickened the air like smoke from the city's burning walls, she stood 17 years old, her posture unbroken even as the guards barked orders. Her name was Gerbal, a princess of the Tangut kingdom, and nothing about her presence was accidental. She had been brought here deliberately, like a prize waiting to be claimed. The fall of her city had been swift but merciless. Tangut resistance had delayed the Mongols for months, long enough to make the eventual retribution severe. When the gates fell, the slaughter was methodical, male captives cut down in the streets. The nobility dragged before Mongol officers for judgment. For Gerbal, the judgment came in the form of a stylus scratching her fate into a wooden ledger. The evaluators circled her slowly, marking her youth, her symmetrical features, the rare pallor of her skin that in Mongol eyes signified delicacy. Her score, 98 out of 100, was so high that murmurs spread through the officials. Nearly perfect. The figure alone determined her destination, not a general, not a noble ally, but the Khan himself. Gerbal's eyes, however, betrayed something the Mongols misread, where they saw defiance as an exotic ornament. She felt it as a blade in her chest. That defiance would have cost her life, if not for the value of her beauty. The Khan's agents noted it, but they saw no danger in a girl who, by their calculation, would be broken soon enough. Around her, the selection continued, her sisters dragged away into different lines, their sobs drowned by the shouts of guards. Her mother, too old to be chosen, was pushed toward the rejection area, an unmarked sentence of death. Gerbal forced herself not to look, not to give the guards the satisfaction of seeing her pain. She had been taught from childhood that a princess's value lay in composure, in keeping her voice steady when others cried, "Now." That lesson was all she had left. She understood in that moment that survival required more than endurance, it required the patience to wait for an opening, no matter how many years it might take. When the selection ended, she was led away from the square under heavy guard. The route took her past the charred remains of her family's palace, past the streets where the bodies of her people still lay in the dust. Every step away from her homeland was a step deeper into the Khan's world, a place she had no illusions about. She knew what awaited her. But as the Mongols measured her body and wrote her score, they had overlooked the one thing they could not quantify: the will to remember. Gerbal would not let the faces of her mother and sisters fade. She would carry them with her into the Khan's tent, into the heart of his empire. And when the time came into the moment, his blood met her blade. To most chroniclers, the Mongol Yam system was a marvel, a network of postal relay stations stretching from Korea to the edges of Eastern Europe, enabling armies to move with impossible speed and messages to reach distant fronts in days instead of months. But beneath the admiration lay a truth recorded only in whispers and in the ledgers of those who worked the stations. The same network that carried orders and intelligence also transported human bodies, turning women into another commodity flowing along the arteries of empire. Every major station was built to a standard plan. There were stables for fresh horses, storerooms for supplies, sleeping quarters for riders, and comfort houses. Official Chinese record used this term with deliberate delicacy. But the reality was far from genteel. These were state-run brothels, stocked with women taken from conquered cities and villages, their presence as routine as hay for the horses. The system was managed with the same precision the Mongols applied to everything. Station masters kept detailed inventories of the women in their charge names if they were allowed to keep them, ethnic origins, health status, pregnancy records, rank-dictated access. An officer arriving with a token of high authority could claim the most prized captives. A common courier might receive only those deemed past their prime. There was no payment. This was an imperial service, funded by the Khan's treasury as part of the machinery of war. To prevent escape or rebellion, women were rotated between stations, often hundreds of miles from their place of capture. A Tangut girl might find herself in Persia within a year. A Russian captive might be sent to serve soldiers in Mongolia. This deliberate scattering stripped away shared language and culture, leaving women isolated, unable to form networks of resistance. The bureaucracy was merciless in its attention to detail. Surviving station records from northern China list daily tallies of services rendered, pregnancies confirmed, and deaths overnight. Too many deaths in a short period could trigger an investigation, not out of compassion, but because it signaled mismanagement of imperial property. Too few services in the log could be seen as inefficiency, an offense punishable by removal or execution. Even the age of the captives was adjusted for utility. Early in the empire's expansion, most victims were between 15 and 35, but by the height of Mongol control, girls as young as 7 were appearing in the ledgers. Administrators had discovered that younger captives lasted longer under the relentless demands placed on them, a grotesque calculus that kept the station supplied for years. Transport between posts was a horror of its own. The women were chained in covered wagons, given minimal food, and denied privacy. Many died along the routes, their bodies dumped unceremoniously by the roadside. Caravan guards recorded these deaths as if noting spoiled goods, the loss absorbed by the empire without pause. The Yam was praised for its efficiency, for shrinking the vastness of the Mongol realm into something that could be crossed with speed and certainty. But for tens of thousands of women, it was not a network of communication, it was a conveyor belt of captivity. And for the Khan, it ensured that the empire's appetite, like its armies, could reach anywhere. By the early decades of the 13th century, the Mongols had mastered not only the art of taking land, but the darker science of reshaping the people who lived on it. Genghis Khan may never have heard the word genetics, yet he understood its power. He had seen with his own eyes that children carried the faces, the strengths, and the loyalties of their fathers. That simple truth became a weapon as potent as any sword in his arsenal. In Mongol thinking, conquering an enemy's territory was only half the task. The real victory was in replacing the enemy's bloodline with one's own. Every captured woman represented a womb that could bear a child loyal to the conquerors, a child who would speak their language, ride in their cavalry, and continue their wars. This was not chance, it was policy. Noble bloodlines were targeted with special precision. Daughters of kings, chieftains, and clan leaders were high-value captives, reserved for the Khan himself or his most trusted generals, marrying them into the Mongol elite or more often. Forcing them into concubinage did more than produce heirs. It dismantled rival dynasties from within, ensuring that the next generation of leadership would carry Mongol blood and Mongol loyalties. The empire established entire camps for pregnant captives. These were not places of mercy, but of management. Women who carried Mongol children received better food and shelter, not from kindness, but to ensure the survival of the fetus. Their movements were monitored, their health recorded in detail. Miscarriages were investigated like acts of sabotage, and women suspected of deliberately ending a pregnancy could face brutal punishments, sometimes extending to their families or fellow captives. Once the children were born, the cycle of control continued. Boys showing physical promise were taken for military training, raised to become the empire's next generation of warriors. Girls were raised for future distribution, either into the harems of high-ranking officials or into the postal station network that serviced the troops. The system was self-replenishing, breeding both soldiers and sexual slaves from the same policy. Over time, the effects were unmistakable. In regions from Central Asia to Eastern Europe, genetic studies now show a dramatic decline or total disappearance of pre-Mongol male lineages. In their place, the Y chromosome of Genghis Khan and his direct male descendants spread like a signature across the map. In some areas, up to 1/3 of the male population carries this genetic marker today. This was conquest written into the body itself. A people might survive physically speaking their old language, telling their old stories, but within a generation, their bloodline no longer belonged entirely to them. Each child born of the policy was a living reminder of defeat, a fusion of enemy and conqueror. And the Mongols, with their ledgers and their discipline, kept perfect track of it all, in their eyes. They were not only building an empire, they were engineering a population. In 1223, the Oirat Confederation, whom some chroniclers called the Oirats, made a fatal choice. They allied with Genghis Khan's enemies and resisted Mongol expansion with a stubbornness that few dared. The result was not only military defeat, but a spectacle of revenge so calculated and so monstrous that its memory would outlive the tribe itself. The Khan's orders were precise. Every Oirat girl between the ages of 7 and 15 was to be taken. Not killed taken. It was a punishment aimed not at the warriors, who would die quickly, but at the entire fabric of Oirat society. Soldiers moved from settlement to settlement, pulling children from their homes, ignoring the screams of mothers and grandmothers who clung to them. The operation lasted 3 days, an organized sweep as efficient as gathering attacks. When the collection was complete, 4,000 girls stood in neat rows in the capital of Kyalik. The square was ringed with armed guards. Behind them, Oirat parents were forced to watch, their wrists bound, their weapons taken, their voices useless against the sheer force of Mongol steel. Genghis Khan himself addressed the crowd through interpreters. His words were not shouted in rage, they were delivered like the terms of a trade agreement. The Oirat men would die, knowing their bloodlines ended here. The women would live long enough to watch their daughters taken, their family names erased from history. There was a choice, though it was no choice at all: submit. And the girls would merely be made sexual slaves, resist, and they would be tortured to death in public. Most parents collapsed into pleas, knowing that any show of defiance would bring only more suffering. The Mongols had calibrated this cruelty perfectly, turning parental love into a tool for obedience. The next stage was a performance. Platforms had been erected in the square so that every parent could see what came next. The girls were divided among different military units, the allocation done in full view. It was not a frenzy, it was a ritual. Soldiers approached in order of rank, claiming their assigned shares. The Khan's officers ensured that the distribution reflected both military hierarchy and political alliances. 2 girls died during the public assaults that followed too. Out of 4,000, the Mongols called this mercy, pointing to the survival rate as proof of their restraint. But survival meant years, even decades, of degradation. The youngest victims, barely old enough to understand what was happening, were kept until they reached useful age, growing up in the very system that had destroyed their childhood. Those girls were marked for life as daughters of Oirat rebels, a designation that followed them wherever they were sent in the empire. Many were given to foreign auxiliary troops, other conquered peoples layering the humiliation across cultural boundaries. The Khan delighted in such ironies, the daughters of one enemy serving the soldiers of another. The Oirat people never recovered. Their population collapsed, their leadership scattered, their cultural identity diluted beyond recognition. Survivors carried the memory of the square in Kyalik like an unhealed wound, passing it down in whispers to the next generation. But for most, there was no next generation. The Mongols had made sure of that. The atrocity became a lesson for the world: resist, and your daughters will become a living monument to your defeat. In the decades that followed, the mere mention of the 4,000 was enough to convince cities to surrender without a fight. By the later years of the Khan's rule, the Mongols no longer relied on crude intimidation. Sexual violence had become an instrument honed with the precision of siege warfare. Each campaign was a laboratory, each conquest an opportunity to refine techniques for maximum physical and psychological impact. They experimented with timing. Some cities saw their women assaulted immediately after the gates fell, shock and speed, leaving no chance for resistance. Others were forced to wait days or weeks, the dread building like a tightening noose. Mongol commanders learned that delayed assault could be as effective as any weapon. The victims' minds broke long before their bodies were touched. They incorporated methods from other cultures they conquered, from Persian torturers. They learned the use of heat and chemical substances to burn the skin, prevent healing, or inflame wounds so that recovery was agony. Steppe traditions contributed their own brutal elements: war horses trained for intimidation and injury. Dogs used to terrify captives into submission. Every sense was exploited. Some women were kept in total darkness for days, then assaulted in blinding sunlight. Others were forced to endure unending noise, Mongol war drums, the chants of soldiers, or the screams of other victims, so that even in moments of stillness, the echoes lived in their skulls. In cold climates, victims were stripped and left shivering in the snow between violations. In deserts, they were dehydrated to the brink of collapse before being used. Climate itself became a weapon. Symbolism was as important as physical harm. The Mongols understood that certain mutilations carried messages more enduring than words. Sewing orifices shut, branding flesh with the marks of their captors, executing women in ways that mirrored perceived offenses. These were all intended to send a message to survivors. This is what resistance earns you. The assaults often had an audience. Fathers were made to choose which daughter would be taken first. Mothers were ordered to decide which child would be spared and which would die. Sometimes the promises of mercy were real, more often. They were lies, designed to shatter the victim's last defenses. Even religion was weaponized. Violations took place inside temples and mosques, forcing victims to curse their gods or praise the Khan while being assaulted. Sacred spaces became stages for desecration, ensuring that trauma infected not only the body, but the spirit. The Mongols kept records of these methods as if they were military strategies. Manuals passed among commanders described effective combinations of psychological and physical harm. Ranked by how quickly they broke a population's will, the results were measurable: faster surrenders, fewer rebellions, and a deep, lasting fear that traveled ahead of the Mongol armies like a shadow. By this stage, the machine of conquest was as much about controlling the womb as the battlefield, the mind as much as the fortress wall. And for one Tangut princess who had lived inside that machine for 3 years, the time for waiting was nearly over. The Tangut kingdom had been a stubborn thorn in the Khan's side for years, positioned on the strategic edge of his empire and protected by fortresses that resisted Mongol assaults longer than most. But in 1226, when Emperor Xianzong made the fatal error of siding with the Khan's enemies, His fate and that of his people was sealed. The siege of Yinchuan was a slow strangulation. Mongol cavalry cut off supply lines while siege engines pounded the walls day and night inside the city. Food grew scarce, and the air in the streets hung heavy with the stench of disease. Gerbal, the emperor's daughter, watched from the palace walls as Mongol banners spread like dark blooms across the horizon. She was 19 by then, her beauty only sharpened by the famine that hollowed the faces of those around her. When the final breach came in the spring of 1227, it was not chaos that followed, it was precision. The Mongols had no interest in letting a city of such value burn uncontrolled. Soldiers flooded the streets in ordered columns, executing resistance cell by cell. Gerbal saw her brothers cut down in the palace courtyard, their heads mounted on spears to mark the family's fall. Her mother chose the only escape left to her, leaping from the highest tower before the soldiers could take her alive. Gerbal tried to follow. She reached the parapet, the wind pulling at her hair, the courtyard spinning far below. But Mongol hands seized her wrists, dragging her back from the edge. Her scream was swallowed by the roar of soldiers claiming their prize. The days that followed were a blur of smoke, noise, and command barked in a language she barely understood. She was herded with other noble captives into the selection lines, where her royal blood and unblemished youth placed her far above the rest in the evaluators' ledgers. 98, nearly perfect. From that moment, she was no longer Gerbal, daughter of the Tangut throne. She was property of the Khan. They transported her in a special caravan for high-value captives, the wagon sealed with thick hides against the elements. Along the road, she memorized the faces of those around her women who would vanish into the empire's machinery before the year was out. She listened to the conversations of her captors, learning the cadence of Mongolian, enough to grasp commands and fragments of gossip. She learned when the guards were alert and when they were distracted, how far the campfires spread at night, and where the sentries stood. Each mile carried her farther from home and deeper into the Khan's world, yet, with every step, she stored away what she saw and heard, weaving a map in her mind not of geography, but of opportunity. She understood she had no power yet, but power could be stolen, piece by piece, from the very hands that held her captive. By the time her wagon reached the Khan's mobile court, Gerbal was no longer only a victim. She was a vessel for memory, for calculation, for something that the Mongols, so precise in their measurements of beauty, had not scored and could not measure the will to destroy him from within. Life inside the Khan's collection was a prison disguised as luxury. Gerbal's quarters were lined with silks from China, rugs from Persia, and gold filigree from lands she had never seen before. Servants brought her food on lacquered trays, bathed her in perfumed water, and dressed her in gowns heavy with embroidery. To an outsider, it might have seemed like privilege, but every piece of finery was a chain, every comfort a reminder that she existed only for one man's use. The Khan's harem was a world of controlled isolation. Women were grouped by ethnicity and rank, guarded by soldiers who neither spoke to them nor allowed them to speak freely to each other. Yet the walls had their own network of whispers, messages traded through gestures, the passing of a comb, or a fragment of cloth folded in a certain way. From these whispers, Gerbal learned the rhythms of the court. She knew which nights the Khan drank heavily after victories, which hours the guards rotated, and when the women brought from the outer camps were least thoroughly searched. She kept her demeanor carefully measured, obedient enough to draw no suspicion, but never eager, never inviting the kind of attention that could hasten her destruction. The years in captivity honed her patience. She mastered the art of appearing small and forgettable, allowing the Khan's eyes to pass over her without lingering too long. Yet she listened, in the background of political discussions. She memorized troop movements and the names of trusted generals. She watched how the Khan's attendants handled his clothing, his weapons, the placement of objects in his tent. The opportunity came from an unlikely ally, an older Jin princess who had been in the Khan's possession for 15 years. The woman's beauty had faded in the Mongol sense, but her mind remained sharp, her hatred intact. One evening, during the communal bathing, she pressed something into Gerbal's palm beneath the water, a thin, double-edged blade, small enough to conceal in the elaborate knot of hair the Mongols favored. The woman did not speak. She didn't need to. in the glint of her eyes. Gerbal saw the years of humiliation and the single, silent wish for vengeance. Whether the blade had been stolen from a careless guard or smuggled through some other channel, Gerbal never learned. She told herself it had belonged to her mother, that it had been hidden and passed down for this moment. The lie gave her strength. In the nights that followed, she practiced the motion in secret, slipping the blade free with one hand, bringing it forward in a single thrust. She rehearsed where to aim low, just beneath the ribs, or, lower still, where it would rob the Khan not only of his life, but of the power he had wielded over countless women. The waiting became its own kind of torture. Weeks passed. The Khan's health, already weakened by years of campaign, began to falter. He summoned his concubines more often, perhaps to distract himself from the creeping hand of mortality. Gerbal waited for the perfect alignment a night when he was tired, drunk, and the guards inattentive. She would only have one chance, and when it came, there could be no hesitation. The night announced itself with thunder. A storm rolled in from the west, the sky split with white fire, rain sweeping across the steppe in jagged bursts. The great tent of the Khan shuddered under the weight of the wind, its ropes creaking like the rigging of a ship at sea. Outside, guards pulled their cloaks tighter, their attention broken by the downpour. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with incense. The Khan lay on a couch piled high with cushions, a silver goblet of fermented mare's milk in one hand, his eyes half lidded from drink. His health had been failing for months, his breath ragged, his movements slower, his posture sagging under invisible weight, but the arrogance of command still clung to him like a second skin. Tonight, he had sent for Gerbal. The summons had come through an attendant with no explanation. She knew better than to ask why. Her hair had been coiled into the intricate style favored by the Khan, and within its loops, hidden among the pins and braids. The thin blade waited its presence a cool, steadying pressure against her skull. She walked the short distance to the Khan's inner chamber with measured steps, the muffled beat of rain on the tent roof masking the sound of her bare feet on the carpets. Every detail burned itself into her senses, the flicker of the oil lamps, the gleam of gold thread in the wall's embroidery, the faint musk of sweat and wine. He gestured for her to come closer. His voice was hoarse but still carried the authority of a man who had never been denied. She knelt beside him, lowering her head in the show of submission that the court demanded. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the unbearable clarity of knowing that everything, every humiliation, every loss had led here. The Khan reached for her. In that instant, she reached for something else. Her fingers slid into her hair, found the blade, and drew it free in one motion. The storm outside crashed in her ears, masking the sound of steel cutting air. "For Tangut," she whispered in perfect Mongolian. The blade drove deep, a precise, practiced thrust. His eyes flew open, confusion flashing into pain, then into a dawning comprehension. The goblet fell from his hand, spilling white liquid across the cushions like a ghost of the blood that followed. He gasped, clutching at the wound, his breath turning to a wet rattle. Gerbal didn't wait to watch him die. She slipped from the couch, past the curtain, into the outer chamber where the other women sat in silence. Some saw the dark stains spreading on her robes and understood instantly. Their gazes held no words, only the recognition that someone had done what none dared. Outside, the storm swallowed her as she ran. The guards, huddled against the rain, barely registered her passing. She did not stop until she reached the cliff where the river boiled far below, swollen with the season's floodwaters. "For Tangut, for my mother, for all of them," she said to the wind. And then she stepped forward, vanishing into the black water just as the first shouts rose from the camp. The storm that swallowed Gerbal's body left more than a dead Khan in its wake, across the vast swath of Asia and Eastern Europe that had endured Mongol conquest. The legacy of his sexual terror had already seeped into the bones of society, reshaping it for centuries to come. In Central Asia, entire communities rebuilt their way of life around one principle: never again. Families adopted purdah so extreme that women were hidden not only from strangers but from distant relatives. The reasoning was grimly practical: if a conqueror could not find you, he could not take you. Girls were kept indoors from early childhood. their faces veiled even within the home when outsiders were present. Invisibility became survival. Architecture changed. Houses were designed with concealed chambers, false walls, and escape tunnels leading to hidden courtyards or neighboring homes. Some cities reorganized their streets so that women's quarters sat at the heart of a defensive maze, protected by layers of gates and dead ends. It was urban planning born not from trade or beauty, but from the memory of raiders breaching the gates. Marriage customs shifted as well. Parents married off daughters at younger ages, believing that a girl tied to a husband's household might be spared the worst if invasion came. Childhood ended at first menstruation. What had once been years of freedom and play became a countdown to confinement. Honor killings took root in some cultures. Better a daughter's death at her family's hands than her capture and public violation. In other places, elaborate virginity checks became a grim tradition, each generation policing the bodies of their daughters in an attempt to guard against a centuries-old threat that no longer rode the steppe but still lived in their blood. Language itself bore the scars. Words for sexual violence vanished from some dialects, replaced by euphemisms so indirect that younger generations no longer understood their origin. Stories and songs carried the warning in veiled form, fables about wolves at the door, or the wind that steals daughters. Religion absorbed the trauma. New prayers appeared in liturgies, asking for protection from the shame of captivity. Pilgrimage shrines emerged on the sites where women had died resisting their captors, their stories canonized into sainthood. The faith of whole regions bent under the weight of what had been done to them, reshaping belief into a fortress as much as a comfort. Even military strategy adapted. Commanders in lands once touched by Mongol hooves made the safeguarding of women a formal part of wartime defense. Fortresses built after the 13th century often included hidden passages leading from women's quarters to escape routes beyond the walls. Armies learned that losing a city was more than losing stone and soil, it was losing generations. The tragedy was that the cure became a prison of its own. The measures meant to protect women also confined them, stripping away freedoms in the name of safety. For centuries, these cultures lived in the shadow of a man long dead, making daily choices as if the Khan's horsemen still waited just beyond the horizon. The Mongol campaigns had ended, but in the markets, in the homes, in the silent spaces between parent and child, the fear endured. It was not just history, it was inheritance. By dawn, the Khan was dead. His generals found him sprawled on silk cushions, the wound impossible to mistake, yet within hours. The official story had already been rewritten. Illness, a hunting accident, a sudden collapse during the night. Anything but the truth that the most feared man in the world had been undone by a teenage girl he had enslaved. Gerbal's body was recovered days later downstream, swollen from the river's cold grasp. There was no funeral, no rites. She was burned without ceremony, her name absent from the records. The Mongol court erased her in ink, but they could not erase her in memory. In the women's quarters, in the postal stations, in the military brothels that still shadowed the empire's armies, her story traveled in whispers. She became the princess who killed the monster, her act repeated in dozens of tongues, altered in detail but constant in spirit, for the women still trapped in the Khan's machinery. Her name was not just a tale, it was a possibility. The empire did not crumble overnight. The machinery of sexual slavery continued with its own momentum, sustained by bureaucrats and generals who had been shaped in its image. But something had shifted. Fear, which had always flowed in one direction from victim to conqueror, now cut both ways. If the Khan himself could bleed, so could any man. If one woman could find a way to strike back, others could dream of doing the same. Centuries later, the genetic shadow of the Mongol Empire remains. 16 million men across the world carry the Y chromosome traceable to Genghis Khan's line, a living reminder of the scale of his campaign of forced reproduction. Each marker is a thread in a vast tapestry of violence, proof written into the human genome. Yet alongside that genetic legacy is another, the legend of Gerbal, though unnamed in official histories. She survives in oral traditions, in folk songs sung in remote valleys, in half-forgotten ballads where the details blur, but the essence endures. A young woman, taken from her home, who waited, watched, and when the moment came, struck a blow that history tried to bury. The Mongol sexual terror remains one of humanity's darkest chapters, systematic, calculated, and enduring in its consequences. But in the folds of that darkness, there is a single, sharp edge of light, the knowledge that even the most absolute power can be cut down by the hand it thought it owned. Gerbal's blade proved that empires can bleed, and legends, once whispered, can outlive the men who tried to silence them.